While testifying in court, my dad said, "My son is a dreamer who can't pay his own bills." The judge interrupted, looked at him, and stated, "He's been a senior surgeon for a decade." The whole courtroom went quiet as my dad's face drained. My name's Jake. I'm 34 now, and for as long as I can remember, my dad's favorite pastime has been reminding me what a letdown he thinks I am. Growing up, I heard words like good-for-nothing dreamer and lazy kid tossed around the dinner table so often they practically became my nickname. It didn't matter if I brought home straight A's, got accepted into a solid college, or even scored my first real job. He always found a way to brush it off like it was nothing. According to him, I was perpetually falling short. As much as I hated to admit it, I dragged that burden around for years. It gnawed at me, made me second-guess myself, and kept me stuck in this endless loop of trying to prove him wrong. You'd figure that by the time I grew up and built a steady life of my own, he'd finally back off. But if anything, he doubled down. He just discovered new ways to embarrass me, usually in front of the whole family. Whenever we had a gathering, he'd lean back with a drink in his hand and tell the same tired story about how, back in high school, I tried to start a lawn mowing business and somehow managed to lose money. He'd spice it up, of course, tossing in bits about how I couldn't fix the mower when it broke or how I charged less than the kid down the block. The table would give this awkward chuckle, and I'd sit there with my face hot, pretending it didn't cut. My mom never said a word during these episodes. She'd just give me a quick sympathetic glance and then look away. My younger sister, Sarah, didn't help either. If anything, she joined the chorus. She'd grin at Dad's stories, toss in her own digs, and remind me I was only the golden child in my own head, not in reality. By the time I hit my mid-20s, it dawned on me I wasn't just dealing with a dad who had no respect for me. I was surrounded by a family that seemed to get a kick out of undercutting me. So I did what anyone in my shoes would do. I put distance between us. I poured myself into my career, pulled long hours, and stopped showing up to every family dinner invitation. I figured maybe if I created enough space, they'd get bored of mocking me. Or maybe, just maybe, they'd notice what they were losing. But Dad wasn't the kind of man who let go. He thrived on control, and my absence only seemed to make him more determined to keep me pegged as the kid who couldn't handle a lawnmower. The breaking point came a few months back, and I never saw it coming. My dad got tangled up in a nasty legal fight with my late uncle's family over property, and in the middle of that mess he decided to drag me in. I tried to stay out of it. I wanted no part of their endless feuds, but before I knew it, I was subpoenaed. I had to sit in that courtroom, forced to listen while my father painted me as too irresponsible to be trusted with anything, not even a slice of family property. Then came the line that still echoes in my head. My son can't even pay his own bills. He's always been a useless dreamer. For a moment the room tilted, and I felt like I was 10 again, sitting at that dinner table with every insult piled on my chest. But this time, things were different. I wasn't the kid who had to take it. I wasn't even the young man silently grinding to prove himself. I was a grown man, with years of hard work behind me and a life I built without him. Then the judge leaned forward, paused, and looked straight at my dad. In a calm, deliberate voice that cut deeper than any yelling, he said, "He's been a senior surgeon for almost a decade." The air in that courtroom shifted. My dad's face went pale, like every drop of blood drained at once. For the first time in my life, he had nothing to say. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was heavy, almost suffocating. I sat there stunned, heart pounding, as years of being painted a failure were stripped away in an instant, and it didn't even come from me. It came from a voice my dad couldn't dismiss, couldn't talk over, and couldn't reduce to a joke. That moment in court was only the spark, though, because what came after is where everything really started to spiral. You'd think that after being called out in front of everyone, my dad might have eased up. Most people, once they've been humiliated publicly, at least learn to bite their tongue. But my father wasn't most people. He had too much pride and too much stubbornness woven into his very being to ever admit he was wrong. Instead of letting up, he dug in even deeper. The following week, my sister Sarah gave me a call. She started off with that syrupy voice she used when she wanted something. "Hey, Jake, just checking in after court. Dad's been really upset, you know?" Her words carried this quiet accusation, like I was the one who had embarrassed him, not the reckless things he said under oath. I stayed quiet, letting her go on, because I could tell she had rehearsed the whole conversation. She went on about how Dad was under a lot of stress and didn't really mean what he said, then slipped in, almost like it was nothing. Besides, you know how you come across sometimes. You don't really open up about your life, and it makes it look like you're hiding something. Maybe if you were more transparent, Dad wouldn't feel the need to say those things. That was Sarah to a T, always pretending to patch the wound while twisting the knife deeper. I told her flat out that I wasn't interested in defending my career choices or my father's inability to show me a shred of respect. Her tone snapped sharp in an instant. "You're always so defensive, Jake. No wonder Dad thinks you're ungrateful." Then she hung up. A few days later, my mom appeared at my apartment without warning, holding a container of food but wearing eyes that looked weighed down. She let out a sigh as she sat at my kitchen table and said she just wanted peace in the family. According to her, Dad felt humiliated and blamed me for making him look foolish in front of the judge. I almost laughed at the insanity of it. The judge had spoken the truth, yet somehow I was the villain in the story. Mom leaned in, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "If you could just talk to him, maybe apologize, it would calm things down." Apologize, that was her solution. Apologize for being insulted in public. Apologize for the career I built with my own two hands. Apologize for the truth finally being spoken out loud. I told her that wasn't going to happen. Her face stiffened, and she stood, leaving the food on the counter. "I don't know what's happened to you," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "You used to be such a kind boy. Now it feels like you only care about yourself." She walked out without looking back. Not long after, the whispers started. A cousin texted me saying Dad had told him I was arrogant now, that I thought I was better than everyone else because of my job. An aunt cornered me at the grocery store and asked why I was turning against my own blood when my father had sacrificed so much for me growing up. It was as if a whole new version of the story was being spread behind my back, and in their retelling, I was the villain. Meanwhile, Dad cast himself as the victim. He told anyone who'd listened that I had humiliated him in front of a judge, that I was disrespectful, that I had abandoned the family. He conveniently left out the part where he called me useless in open court. He repeated his version so many times that by the time the next family dinner rolled around, when I finally forced myself to show up, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The moment I walked in, the conversation died, and everyone's eyes flicked between me and my father. He barely looked my way, but when he did, he wore that smug little smirk that said, "I've already turned them all against you." And the worst part? He had. At the end of the meal, Sarah piped up that she and her husband were trying to buy a house and needed help with the down payment. Without missing a beat, my dad said, "Jake can help with that, can't you? He's doing so well these days." Suddenly, the whole table was staring at me, waiting for me to agree. I felt like I'd just been ambushed. I shook my head and said as evenly as I could, "I'm not giving anyone money." The silence that followed my refusal was like a weight pressing down on the whole room. My dad let out a loud, derisive scoff and leaned back in his chair with that same mocking laugh I'd been hearing since I was a kid. "See? All that schooling, all that money, and he still can't even take care of his own family. Just proves what I've been saying all along. Selfish, useless dreamer." I clenched my jaw so tight I thought something might crack. The air buzzed with uneasy laughter, a couple of awkward coughs, and then Sarah piped up, "Wow, Jake, you really can't let go of the past, can you? We're family. We help each other." But that wasn't help. It was expectation, obligation, manipulation. And in that moment, it hit me harder than ever that no matter what I did, no matter how much I built or achieved, they were determined to drag me back into the role they'd assigned me as a kid. That dinner was the point where something shifted. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was about control. And if I didn't put a stop to it, they'd keep tightening their grip until I either broke completely or finally fought back. The weeks after that disastrous dinner felt like poison dripping slowly into my veins. Every interaction, every call, came laced with some new demand or guilt trip. If I ignored them, I was accused of turning my back on the family. If I picked up, it was the same chorus on repeat. "Help your sister, support your dad. Why are you being so cold?" It didn't matter what I said. They'd already decided I was the villain. And then came the betrayal, the kind that cuts the last, fragile thread of trust clean in two. It started with a letter in the mail. At first glance I thought it was junk, But when I saw my bank's name in the corner, my stomach knotted. Inside was a notice. A loan application had been filed under my name and flagged for extra verification. I froze. I hadn't applied for any loan. When I called the bank, the rep hesitated, then told me someone had tried to co-sign using my information. The applicant, Sarah. I sat at my desk gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. She hadn't even asked. She'd taken my personal information, probably from some old family paperwork years back, and tried to use it to secure a massive loan. The only reason it didn't go through was because the signatures didn't match and, thankfully, I had alerts set up on my credit. The rage that washed over me in that moment is hard to explain. It wasn't just anger at what she'd done. It was the gut punch of realizing my own sister, the person who'd shared the same roof, the same holidays, the same childhood, didn't see me as a brother, but as a resource to exploit. And deep down, without even needing to ask, I knew exactly whose fingerprints were on this. It was too brazen, too entitled, too reckless to be just Sarah's idea. I called her right away. She picked up on the second ring, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Jake, how are you?" I didn't waste a second. "Why did you try to take out a loan in my name?" There was a pause, then a sharp sigh. "Oh, that. Don't be so dramatic, Jake. Dad said it would be fine. We were just trying to speed things up with the house. You make plenty of money. You wouldn't even notice. You stole my identity." I cut in, my voice shaking. "Do you get that? That's a crime." Her tone snapped, cold and defensive. "Don't talk to me like that. We're family. You're supposed to help. Dad said you'd react like this, all self-righteous. But it's not a big deal. If the bank hadn't made a fuss, it would have gone through and we'd all be better off." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. My hands were trembling as I set the phone down, my heart pounding like a drum. I wanted to believe it was just her, but I already knew whose shadow was behind it. The confirmation came 2 days later, when Dad showed up at my apartment without warning. He walked in like he owned the place, dropped onto my couch, and said, "You made a fool of yourself with that bank nonsense. Do you realize how childish you look, making such a fuss over paperwork?" My dad sneered. I just stared at him, too stunned to speak. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to that slow, patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years. "That loan would have helped your sister get her start. You think you're better than us because of your title and your paycheck, but you're not. You owe this family, Jake. Without us, you wouldn't be where you are." Something inside me snapped in that moment. It wasn't just the trust that broke. It was the illusion that somewhere beneath all the cruelty, they cared about me at all. They didn't. To them, I was nothing more than a walking bank account, a punching bag for blame, a scapegoat when their own lives came up short. I told him to leave. He laughed as he stood, shook his head, and muttered, "Ungrateful. Always have been." Then he slammed the door on his way out. I sat in the silence of my apartment, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a physical burden. For years, I had tried to keep the peace, brushed off the insults, tried to play the bigger man. But this wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was theft. This was manipulation so blatant I couldn't excuse it. And in that instant, I knew there was no going back. The days after he stormed out felt like stumbling through fog. I went to work, scrubbed into surgeries, spoke to patients with the same calm professionalism I always had. But inside, I felt hollow. Every time I peeled off my gloves and washed my hands, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. A senior surgeon, respected in the hospital, yet somehow still reduced to a child in his father's eyes. Worse, reduced to a tool to be used and tossed aside. The loan fiasco left ripples I never expected. My credit report flagged the attempted fraud, and I spent hours on the phone with banks, verifying my identity, freezing accounts, and explaining to strangers that, yes, my own sister had tried to forge my name. Each call chipped away at me. It wasn't just paperwork. It wasn't just paperwork. It was humiliation. I had to say it aloud, admit it, make it real. My sister tried to take out a loan in my name. The more I repeated it, the heavier it became. Meanwhile, the calls from family kept coming, but not with apologies, with accusations. Sarah left me a voicemail crying about how I'd ruined her future. My mom sent paragraphs insisting family should come first and warning me not to let bitterness destroy everything. An uncle I hadn't spoken to in years even called to say I should let it slide for my father's sake. It was like they'd all decided in unison that I was the problem. Not the fraud, not the lies, not the betrayal, but me, for daring to say no. I stopped answering, silenced my phone, let the messages pile up while I tried to cling to the quiet in my apartment. But at night, it wasn't quiet. At night, the words echoed in my head. Useless dreamer. Ungrateful son. Selfish. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I had grown arrogant. Maybe I was cold. Maybe everything I had worked for couldn't erase the flaws they'd been hammering into me since I was a kid. The blow landed hardest one Friday evening. I just finished a grueling 14-hour shift, a surgery that ran long, and came home to find an envelope slipped under my door. No return address, just my name scrawled in my father's handwriting. My chest tightened before I even tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Across it, in his sharp, impatient script, "You will regret turning your back on us. Blood is blood. You can't escape family." I sank to the floor, the letter trembling in my hands. And for the first time in years, I cried. Not a quiet tear, not a choked sob, but the kind of raw, shuddering grief that rips through you when you finally accept the people who should have protected you are the very ones destroying you. I hated that he could still do this to me, still strip me down to nothing with just a few cruel sentences. But somewhere inside that breakdown, something else began to stir. I couldn't tell if it was anger, survival instinct, or just plain exhaustion, but one thought planted itself firmly in my mind. I can't keep living like this. I couldn't keep letting their voices drown out mine. I couldn't keep pretending I belonged to a family that saw me only as a scapegoat and a wallet. The next morning, I started with small steps. I called the bank again and locked down my accounts with even stricter security. I reached out to a lawyer friend, asked a few careful questions about what my options were if the fraud attempts kept coming. I didn't unload the whole story, just enough to start laying groundwork. And then, for the first time in years, I pulled out a notebook and began to write. Not surgical notes, not work-related plans, but a plain list. At the top I wrote, "What I will no longer tolerate." The page filled quickly. No more surprise visits. No more financial traps. No more letting their insults define who I am. By the time I set the pen down, my hand was trembling, not from fear, but from something else. Resolve, maybe. The fog wasn't gone, but I could see the faint outline of a path forward. I wasn't healed yet. I was still raw, still reeling. But I knew one thing with certainty. I was done being their victim. And sooner or later, they were going to find out exactly what kind of useless dreamer I really was. The shift didn't come in one dramatic moment. It wasn't like the movies where you wake up one morning free of pain and with a plan fully formed. It was gradual, like blood creeping back into a limb that's been numb for too long. But the more I leaned into my own life and pulled away from theirs, the more I realized how much space they'd been renting in my head. Work became my refuge. I'd always been proud of what I did, but now I dove into it with fresh intensity. I took on harder surgeries, mentored the younger doctors, and accepted speaking invitations I used to avoid. One afternoon, the hospital director pulled me aside and said, "Jake, you know you're becoming one of our cornerstones here." It floored me. For years I had lived under one story, that I was inadequate, undeserving, a disappointment. To have someone I deeply respected recognize my worth felt like breathing fresh air after years underwater. The recognition spilled outside the hospital walls too. I published a paper on a surgical technique I had refined, and it caught attention in medical circles. Before long, I was invited to present at a conference overseas. Standing on that stage, the lights hot against my face, looking out at hundreds of peers taking notes and nodding along. It felt like stepping into the life I had imagined for myself all along, but had never fully believed I deserved. Financially, things started to expand as well. With renewed focus came opportunities one might have overlooked before. I made smart investments, cautious, not reckless, and for the first time in my life, I felt true security. I wasn't just earning money. I was building something lasting. And the irony wasn't lost on me, that the same man who mocked me as a dreamer had become the reason I was determined never to rely on him or anyone else. But it wasn't just work that grew. I began tending to the parts of my personal life I had neglected. I reconnected with old friends, people who reminded me who I was beyond my family's shadow. I even dipped my toes back into dating. Nothing heavy at first, just dinners and conversations. but even those felt like reclaiming parts of myself I had let go of. Laughter came easier. The silence in my apartment no longer felt suffocating, it felt like peace. Of course, word of my progress trickled back to my family, and their reactions were exactly what you'd expect. Sarah texted me one evening after pictures from the conference hit the internet. "Wow, Mr. Big Shot now, huh? Don't forget who changed your diapers." It was meant to sting, but all it did was prove how small her world had become. My dad, according to a cousin, had started telling people my achievements were nothing but luck or overblown hype. The higher I climbed, the more desperate my dad became to yank me back down. Yet his bitterness didn't land the way it used to. It no longer cut, it slid right off me. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to prove anything. I didn't need their approval. I had my own, and for once, that was enough. Still, in the quiet moments, the sting of the past crept in. I'd catch myself replaying the courtroom scene, the attempted loan, the letter shoved under my door. The anger hadn't vanished, it had changed shape. It wasn't the raw, all-consuming fire anymore. It was steady now, low, controlled, focused. I'd learned not to act rashly. But I also knew this. The balance had shifted. They had tried to brand me a failure. They had tried to lean on me as their crutch. They had tried to crush me under their weight. And yet, here I stood, stronger, sharper, unbound. Slowly, a thought began to form. What if I didn't just walk away? What if I showed them, calmly and deliberately, who I had become? Not with shouting matches or petty back and forths, but with actions they couldn't distort, achievements they couldn't discredit, choices they couldn't manipulate. I wasn't ready to move yet, but for the first time in my life, I realized something. I didn't have to survive their games anymore. I was in a position to end them. The setup started almost without me noticing. I wasn't sitting around plotting revenge, at least not consciously. But when you've spent years on the defensive, taking hit after hit, you start seeing patterns others miss. You notice small details. You file things away. And as my life steadied and grew, those old survival habits started giving me an edge. It began with Sarah. Word reached me through a mutual acquaintance, an old college friend of hers who'd been in town for a wedding, that she and her husband were in far worse financial shape than anyone realized. Their dream home had turned into a money pit. Renovations were stalled, bills were piling up, and that attempted loan in my name hadn't just been desperation, it had been necessity. The house was half finished, the mortgage was eating them alive, and they were quietly borrowing from family just to stay afloat. I tucked that away. Then there was my father. I kept my distance, but one day while checking on some family property records, something I had ignored for years, I noticed something odd. A piece of land that had belonged to my late uncle, the very property at the heart of that courtroom dispute, had been quietly transferred. On paper it looked like a sale, but the numbers were off. The buyer was a Shell LLC, and when I dug through public filings, I found it had been registered by one of my dad's longtime drinking buddies, a man who couldn't spell equity if you handed him the first 5 letters. It didn't take a genius to see what was happening. Dad was hiding assets, shuffling paperwork, probably trying to keep property out of reach from other relatives or creditors. I filed that away too. The final piece dropped into my lap at work. A colleague who knew my family lived nearby casually mentioned seeing my dad arguing at the county office. He hadn't noticed me there, but apparently the clerk had grown tired of Dad's yelling and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sir, if you don't pay the overdue taxes, this property will be repossessed. It doesn't matter what your family name is." Overdue taxes, hidden transfers, a daughter drowning in debt. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like their scapegoat anymore. I felt like someone standing in the shadows, watching as they dug their own holes with shovels they didn't even realize I could see. The more I thought about it, the sharper the picture became. They had always assumed I was powerless, that I was too timid or too naive to fight back. They had bet everything on the version of me they had bullied into silence. But that version of me was gone. In his place stood someone with resources, connections, knowledge, and above all, patience. So I began to prepare. Quietly, deliberately. I reached out to my lawyer friend again, but this time I wasn't just asking about fraud protections. I had him walk me through the finer details of property law and inheritance disputes. I framed it as curiosity, professional interest, but I listened hard and took notes. I reviewed my own finances, locked down my accounts even tighter, made sure nothing of mine could be touched without my explicit consent. And slowly, piece by piece, I began gathering receipts, literal and figurative, copies of public records, notes from conversations, printouts of tax delinquencies, whispers passed to me by mutual acquaintances. Every scrap went into a folder I kept locked in my office. Not because I was ready to act yet, but because I knew one day the moment would come. Each evening I'd sit in my quiet apartment with that folder on my desk and feel its weight. Not physical weight, but the symbolic weight of years. Years of insults, manipulation, betrayal. Years of being told I was nothing. Now, finally, I held proof that the people who mocked me were standing on a house of cards. And when that house started to shake, I'd be ready. I didn't rush it. That was the key. Real payback, the kind that echoes, isn't about snapping in anger. It's about patience, timing, making sure the other side never even sees the punch until it's already landed. For months, I watched quietly as the cracks in my family's facade widened. It started with Sarah. Her dream home had turned into a nightmare. Contractors walked off unpaid. The mortgage fell behind, and she and her husband were juggling credit cards just to cover groceries. Outwardly, they still tried to project an image of moving up in the world. I waited, silent, until one evening she called me, her voice brittle but coated in forced brightness. "Jake," she began, "I've been thinking about how close we were as kids. Don't you miss that? I just feel like we've drifted, and I'd love to rebuild that bond. Family is everything, you know?" I let her ramble for almost 10 minutes before cutting in. "How much do you need?" There was a pause, then a nervous laugh. "What? Oh, come on, Jake." I wasn't. "How much?" I asked again. The silence stretched, and then she finally admitted it. They were staring down foreclosure. They needed tens of thousands. Fast. I told her I'd think about it. But instead of sending money, I sent an anonymous tip to the bank's fraud department about her previous attempt to co-sign under my name. I attached the documentation I had carefully saved. I knew it wouldn't land her in prison, not yet, but it would throw a red flag on any financial application she touched. Which meant that when she and her husband tried to refinance the house, the doors slammed shut. The foreclosure notice came within weeks, and I hadn't had to raise my voice. I hadn't had to lift more than a pen. Then came my father. His Shell LLC game had always been sloppy, and I suspected he was counting on no one in the family being savvy enough to connect the dots. But I wasn't the boy who once got mocked for losing money mowing lawns. I was a surgeon, precise by nature, patient by training, and now armed with knowledge. With my lawyer friend's help, I compiled every record I'd uncovered. The transfers, the overdue taxes, the shady registrations. We didn't go straight to court. That would have been too obvious. Instead, we filed a quiet inquiry with the county, citing concerns over irregular property transfers. Bureaucracy is slow, but relentless. Weeks later, my father erupted in the family group chat, raging about government parasites and nosy officials. He didn't know it was me who had lit the match. All I had to do was sit back while the county flagged his properties for review and the IRS took an interest in his taxes. I kept my distance, and that ended up being the sweetest part. I didn't argue with him, didn't show up for shouting matches, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing I was behind any of it. I lived my life. Went to conferences, scrubbed into surgeries, smiled at coworkers, and let the world he thought he controlled quietly fall apart behind the curtain. The final twist came when a cousin who'd once texted me echoing Dad's insults called in a panic. "Did you hear about your dad? They're saying he might lose the property." And Sarah? She and her husband are back living with Mom. "It's bad, Jake. Real bad." I almost laughed, but I didn't. I just said calmly, "I hope they figure it out." That was the point. There was no need to gloat or declare victory. The power had already shifted. They'd spent years telling everyone I was nothing, and now their own greed, lies, and entitlement were the thing dragging them down, without me lifting a finger. The next time I saw my father, of all places, was at a relative's funeral, and he looked smaller, less in stature, more in presence. He came toward me with that open mouth like he wanted to sneer, but no words came, just a tight, pale smile. Then he turned away. For the first time ever, he had nothing to say to me. But I wasn't done yet. The fallout moved faster than I expected. Within months, the image he'd clung to for years, control, success, the pedestal built by tearing me down, crumbled. The county seized one of his properties for unpaid taxes. The IRS froze accounts while they combed through filings, and the shady friends he leaned on for favors vanished when the heat came. Sarah and her husband ended up with no house, no savings, and wrecked credit. They slunk back to my parents' place and filled it with more tension than ever. Mom started calling late at night, voice breaking. "I don't know how much more I can take, Jake." I had nothing to offer her but silence. I wasn't going to be the bandage while she refused to stop bleeding for Dad and Sarah. The extended family whispers changed too. Those same relatives who once parroted Dad's lines about me being selfish began avoiding his eye. Conversations died when he entered a room, and the humiliation he used to heap on me now settled squarely on him. He tried to spin new tales of persecution, of government vendettas, of me turning cold and abandoning them. But this time nobody laughed or nodded along. They looked at him like you look at a man ranting on a street corner, bitter and broken. And me? I lived. I thrived. My career kept growing. My name gained weight in my field. My circle of real friends and colleagues tightened up, and for the first time my life wasn't shaped by what they said. I'd stepped out of their shadow while they collapsed under their own entitlement. The last scene played out one Sunday morning. I left a cafe downtown and saw him sitting alone on a bench, wrinkled clothes, drawn face, hunched shoulders. He looked up, and for a heartbeat I could see a flicker of recognition, like the man who'd once towered over me finally understood what he'd lost. Maybe he was going to ask for help, maybe for money or forgiveness. I'll never know, because I didn't stop. I met his eyes, calm and steady, and said simply, "You were wrong about me." Then I walked on and left him in the silence he'd once weaponized against me. For the first time, it wasn't my chest carrying the weight of his words, it was his. And that, more than anything, was the revenge that tasted right.